Look at this photograph. One of the largest and busiest harbors on the eastern Mediterranean, stretching along Lebanon's coastline, massive cargo cranes, container yards, warehouses, and grain silos dominate the waterfront. Ships from around the world dock here daily, loading and unloading freight. Behind the port, the city of Beirut rises up the hillsides, apartment buildings, offices, hospitals, schools, embassies, home to hundreds of thousands of people living and working within a few miles of these docks. Somewhere in this photograph, in a warehouse labeled Hangar 12, sits 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. It's been there since 2014, impounded from an abandoned cargo ship. For 6 years, Lebanese customs officials have been sending letters to judges, trying to find anyone to remove this material. They know it's dangerous. In July 2020, just weeks before disaster strikes, Lebanon's Higher Defense Council will inform President Aoun that dangerous materials are being stored in the port. He will immediately order military and security agencies to remove it safely. But the cargo will remain in Hangar 12. On August 4, 2020, at 6:07 p.m., that warehouse will explode with a force of approximately 1.1 kilotons of TNT, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The blast will be felt 150 miles away in Cyprus. An orange-red mushroom cloud will rise over Beirut. The explosion will kill 218 people, injure 7,000 more, and displace 300,000 residents. It will cause an estimated $15 billion in damage. 3 hospitals will be obliterated. The country's largest grain silo, containing less than a month's supply of grain, will be destroyed. Buildings within a 6-mile radius will suffer varying levels of damage. This isn't a story of terrorism or war, this is a story of bureaucratic dysfunction, abandoned property, and a 750-ton bomb that sat ignored in a major city's port for 6 years despite repeated warnings. It's a story of welding sparks, impounded cargo, and an investigation so plagued by political interference that by 2023, all suspects will be released with no one held accountable. So what really happened there? What triggered this explosion? Before we begin this investigation, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We love seeing our global audience and how this story reaches people around the world. The port of Beirut has been operational since the 1880s, playing a crucial role in Lebanon's economy and serving as a vital gateway for Mediterranean trade. The port gained particular strategic importance during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990, after the war ended, and as Beirut began the long process of rebuilding itself from decades of conflict, the port became increasingly important as the country worked toward economic recovery and reconciliation. By the 2010s, it had grown into one of the busiest ports on the eastern Mediterranean, handling massive volumes of freight and serving as Lebanon's primary maritime gateway. Like any major port, Beirut regularly dealt with the mundane realities of international shipping, vessels arriving and departing, cargo being loaded and unloaded, customs inspections, fees and documentation, and occasionally ship abandonment. Ship abandonment occurs when vessel owners simply disavow their property, usually because the ship has become financially unviable, and leave it in port. Often the crew is left stranded, sometimes for months or even years, until legal issues are resolved. The lucky crew members usually manage to leave and return home. Sometimes unfortunate souls remain trapped aboard, unable to leave until lawyers and governments sort out the mess. On November 21, 2013, a cargo ship flying the Moldovan flag entered the port of Beirut. Her name was the MV Rhosus. She was a 2,950 gross ton cargo vessel, built in 1986 in Naruto, Japan, originally as a dredger named Daifuku Maru No. 8. Over the years she had changed hands multiple times, changed names, and even changed her primary use from dredging to cargo transport. Her final owner was Igor Grechushkin, a Russian businessman based in Limassol, Cyprus, who had purchased the vessel in 2012. This was Grechushkin's first experience owning a ship, and it would not go well. The MV Rosus was not in good condition. In July 2013, just months before arriving in Beirut, she had been detained by Spanish authorities in the port of Seville. The ship was literally falling apart, poorly maintained, mechanically unreliable, with structural issues that made her barely seaworthy. After eventually being released from Seville, she was chartered to transport a very specific and very dangerous cargo, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate packed in bags. The shipment was arranged in September 2013 by Rustavi Azot LLC, a Georgian fertilizer manufacturer. The ammonium nitrate, a chemical compound commonly used in agricultural fertilizers, but also capable of detonating with tremendous force under certain conditions, was to be transported from Batumi, Georgia, to Fábrica de Explosivos Mozambique in Matola, Mozambique. By September 27, 2013, the MV Rosus was loaded up with her explosive cargo and departed from Batumi, stopping at various ports along her route toward the Suez Canal. But there was a problem. Actually, there were multiple problems. The ship was experiencing serious financial difficulties. Owner Igor Grechushkin didn't have sufficient funds to pay the Suez Canal transit fees, a substantial cost for passing through one of the world's most important maritime choke points. To solve this cash flow problem, Grechushkin arranged for the ship to pick up an additional cargo along the way to Mozambique. This additional shipment would generate enough revenue to cover the Suez Canal fees. Problem solved, at least in theory, but there was a snag. The MV Rosus had a significant structural deficiency. The cargo hatches were severely rusted and weakened. Captain Boris Prokoshev, the Ukrainian captain commanding the vessel, would later explain in an interview with the BBC, "The hatches were buckled and weak, so we couldn't take it. We refused. Taking on additional cargo when the hatches designed to protect that cargo were compromised would have been dangerous and potentially catastrophic if they failed at sea. Refusing the additional cargo came with financial consequences. There was a contractual penalty, a fine that Grechushkin refused to pay. On top of that fine, there were port fees accumulating. As these financial obligations went unpaid, Lebanese authorities took action. The MV Rosus was officially impounded in the port of Beirut on November 21, 2013. The ship wasn't going anywhere until the debts were settled. For the crew, this became a nightmare. Most of the crew members managed to eventually leave the ship and return to their home country of Ukraine. But Captain Prokoshev and a few others remained trapped aboard, unable to leave, essentially held hostage by the legal dispute over unpaid fees. They would remain stuck on the impounded vessel for approximately 1 year. Eventually, by selling some of the ship's fuel and using the proceeds to hire a lawyer, they managed to secure their own release and finally escape back to Ukraine. But the MV Rosus herself remained in Beirut, and critically, so did her cargo. By this point, owner Grechushkin had reportedly claimed to be bankrupt, walking away from his failed shipping venture. The original cargo owners, Rustavi Azot LLC and the Mozambique Explosives Company, had lost interest in the shipment, which had been sitting in Beirut for months with mounting storage fees and legal complications. It simply wasn't worth the cost and hassle to retrieve it. So the cargo was offloaded from the MV Rosus in 2014 and moved into a warehouse facility in the port designated as Hangar 12. All 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, approximately 5.5 million pounds of potentially explosive material, was now sitting in bags stacked in a warehouse in one of the busiest sections of a major city's port. The MV Rosus herself, still moored in the port and abandoned, eventually took on water and sank at her berth. Her journey from Japan to Beirut had ended in complete failure, leaving behind a cargo that would prove to be catastrophically dangerous. For Lebanese customs officials, the situation quickly became what one might charitably call a headache, or more accurately, a nightmare. They were now responsible for housing what was essentially a 750-ton bomb in the middle of a functioning port in a densely populated city. Ammonium nitrate, while commonly and safely used as fertilizer when properly handled and stored, is also one of the most powerful explosive materials when it detonates. It had been responsible for numerous industrial disasters throughout history, including the 1947 Texas City disaster that killed nearly 600 people and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168. Lebanese officials understood they had a serious problem. Over the following years, they made repeated attempts to resolve the situation, sending letters to judges requesting legal resolution to the issue of the abandoned cargo. They were trying to find someone, the ship's owner, the cargo owners, the shipping company, anyone, to take responsibility for removing the material. But bureaucratic wheels grind slowly, and in Lebanon's complex political system, with its delicate sectarian balance and chronic dysfunction, nothing moved quickly. In July 2020, 6 years after the cargo was placed in Hangar 12, Lebanon's Higher Defense Council finally informed President Aoun that dangerous materials were being stored in Beirut's port. The president immediately ordered military and security agencies to do whatever was necessary to safely remove the ammonium nitrate. It was a direct order from the country's highest executive authority. But tragically, the cargo would remain in Hangar 12 for another month. The bureaucratic process of actually implementing the president's order, determining who would do the work, how it would be done, where the material would go, who would pay for it, moved too slowly. On August 4, 2020, Hangar 12 was an active work site. A team of welders had been contracted to perform door repairs on the warehouse. This was routine maintenance work, the kind of minor repair job that happens constantly in any major port facility. The welders arrived that afternoon and began their work. Hangar 12 was storing more than just the ammonium nitrate. It also contained a substantial quantity of fireworks, another poorly thought-out storage decision given the explosive cargo already present. At approximately 5:45 p.m. 1745, sparks from the welding operation landed on the pile of fireworks. A small fire started immediately, port authorities were notified, and a team of firefighters was dispatched. The response was quick. The firefighters arrived at the scene just 10 minutes later, at approximately 5:55 p.m. But when they arrived, conditions were already deteriorating rapidly. The hangar was emitting strange noises, pops and cracks from the fireworks igniting. The fire was intensifying, spreading through the fireworks stockpile. At 6 or 7 p.m., 1807, witnesses heard and felt a significant explosion. Investigators would later estimate this first blast had a yield of between 1.5 and 2.5 tons of TNT equivalent. Fireworks flashed and sparked as Hangar 12 showed visible signs of structural damage. Smoke billowed from the building. People throughout the port area and nearby neighborhoods could see something serious was happening. Some began filming on their phones. Others moved closer to get a better view, unaware of the catastrophe about to unfold. 33 to 35 seconds after that first explosion, at approximately 6:08 p.m., a much larger explosion erupted from Hangar 12. This was the main event, the detonation of 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. Investigators would later estimate the yield at approximately 1.1 kilotons of TNT equivalent, roughly 5 to 10% of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, making it one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The blast wave propagated outward at supersonic speed, radiating from Hangar 12 in all directions. The explosion could be felt 150 miles away in Cyprus, across open water, in another country. In Beirut itself, the shock wave was devastating and immediate. An enormous orange-red mushroom cloud rose into the sky, a distinctive color characteristic of ammonium nitrate explosions due to nitrogen dioxide gas released in the detonation. The cloud would become one of the most widely shared images of 2020, captured on countless videos from multiple angles as people throughout the city had been filming the initial fire. The immediate destruction around Hangar 12 was total and absolute. The warehouse itself was completely obliterated, vaporized by the force of the detonation. Next door stood Lebanon's largest grain silo, a massive concrete structure containing the country's strategic grain reserves. The silo took the full force of the blast. Its western face, closest to the explosion, was shredded and partially collapsed. The structure that remained was so severely damaged that it would eventually fully collapse in 2022. The destruction of the grain silo was catastrophic for Lebanon's food security. The country now had less than 1 month's supply of grain, a crisis made even worse because Lebanon was already struggling economically, and the world was still dealing with COVID-19 disruptions to food supply chains. The blast wave radiated outward from the epicenter in a rapidly expanding circle of destruction. Buildings within a 6-mile radius suffered varying levels of damage based on their distance from the explosion, their construction type, and whether they had direct line of sight to the blast. Close to the port, structures were completely destroyed or rendered structurally unsound. Glass and facade damage extended much farther. The characteristic blast wave, visible in videos as a spherical pressure front propagating outward, shattered windows, blew out doors, collapsed balconies, and caused partial building collapses throughout central Beirut. 3 hospitals were obliterated or damaged so severely they became non-operational. This was catastrophic timing. Within minutes of the explosion, thousands of injured people would desperately need medical care. But 3 of the city's hospitals, the very facilities that should have been receiving and treating casualties, were themselves disaster sites with their own injured staff and damaged infrastructure. The remaining hospitals in Beirut were quickly overwhelmed, dealing with a massive influx of casualties while also operating under COVID-19 restrictions and protocols that limited capacity. The damage extended beyond purely functional buildings to include significant cultural heritage sites, museums, historic buildings, architectural landmarks that had survived Lebanon's brutal civil war from 1975 to 1990 were damaged or destroyed. Embassies representing nations from around the world suffered damage, their buildings blown apart by the blast wave. The explosion was indiscriminate, affecting every sector of the city: residential, commercial, governmental, cultural, within its radius of destruction. Ships moored in the harbor and vessels passing nearby suffered extensive damage. The cruise ship Orient Queen, a large passenger vessel that had been docked in port, was hit so hard by the blast wave that she capsized, rolling over and sinking at her berth. Cargo vessels had their superstructures torn off, windows and equipment destroyed. Smaller boats were thrown by the pressure wave or swamped by the water displacement from the explosion. The harbor that had been a scene of normal commercial activity moments before now looked like a war zone, with burning and damaged vessels scattered throughout. On the streets of Beirut, the immediate aftermath was chaos. People who had been going about their normal evening activities, shopping, walking home from work, sitting in cafes, driving, were suddenly thrown into a disaster zone. Many were killed instantly by collapsing buildings or flying debris. Others were trapped under rubble calling for help. Some were wandering in shock, bleeding from cuts caused by flying glass, disoriented by the blast wave that had ruptured eardrums and caused concussive injuries even at significant distances from the explosion. Anyone who could help immediately began doing so. This spontaneous civilian response was crucial in the first hours after the blast, before organized emergency services could fully mobilize. People pulled victims out of damaged buildings with their bare hands. Any working vehicle in and around the port area was pressed into service as emergency transport. Private cars, delivery vans, motorcycles, all became ambulances carrying injured people to whatever hospitals could still function. In total, 75 ambulances and 375 medics were officially dispatched to assist the injured and trapped, but the actual response was much larger when you include the civilian volunteers and private vehicles. Local businesses immediately began offering whatever they could. Restaurants provided food and water, pharmacies dispensed medical supplies, hotels opened their doors to the displaced. This grassroots response was essential because the official government response, while present, was overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The international community began responding within hours. The Netherlands, Turkey, and the United Kingdom were among the first nations to send specialized urban search and rescue teams, experts trained to locate and extract survivors from collapsed structures. France, Lebanon's former colonial power, and a country with long-standing ties to Lebanon, sent rescue teams and medical supplies. International aid organizations mobilized resources. The United Nations coordinated international assistance efforts. A day after the explosion, on August 5, Prime Minister Hassan Diab declared a 2-week state of emergency, granting authorities expanded powers to manage the crisis. The government launched an official investigation into the explosion. In the days and weeks following the blast, the truly staggering scale of destruction became clearer. Approximately 300,000 people, roughly 12% of Beirut's population, were displaced from their homes, which were either destroyed or damaged so severely they were uninhabitable. The death toll climbed as bodies were recovered from rubble and as some of the critically injured succumbed to their wounds. The final count reached approximately 218 dead, a number that was tragically both significant and surprisingly low, given the magnitude of the explosion. The relatively low death toll was largely due to timing. The explosion occurred at 6:08 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Many office buildings were less occupied than they would have been during business hours. Many schools were closed due to COVID-19. If the explosion had occurred at midday on a weekday, the death toll would have been substantially higher. Among the dead were the firefighters who had responded to the initial fire, the first team that arrived at 5:55 p.m. and was working to control the fireworks blaze when the main explosion occurred. These men died doing their jobs, responding to what they thought was a routine fire, having no idea they were standing next to thousands of tons of explosives. Their deaths highlighted a crucial failure. The firefighters apparently weren't informed about what was stored in Hangar 12. They walked into a situation blind, without critical information that might have changed their approach or caused them to evacuate the area, and establish a safety perimeter. Another 7,000 people were injured, many seriously. Injuries ranged from cuts from flying glass, by far the most common injury due to the massive number of windows that shattered, to severe trauma from collapsing structures, burns from secondary fires, crush injuries from being trapped under rubble, and blast injuries including ruptured eardrums, lung damage from pressure waves, and traumatic brain injuries from the shock wave. Hospitals struggled to cope with the volume of casualties while also dealing with damage to their own facilities and shortages of supplies. The economic impact was staggering. Initial estimates put the direct damage at approximately $15 billion US. This figure includes destroyed buildings, damaged infrastructure, lost inventory and equipment, and the value of the destroyed grain reserves. For Lebanon, a small country already in the midst of a severe economic and financial crisis even before the explosion, this was catastrophic. Lebanon's economy had been struggling for years, with a currency crisis, banking sector collapse, and massive public debt. The country was also dealing with the economic impacts of COVID-19, which had devastated the tourism sector and disrupted trade. The explosion effectively destroyed Lebanon's primary port, crippling the country's ability to import goods. Lebanon imports roughly 80% of its food and most of its fuel, medical supplies, and other essential goods. With the port of Beirut heavily damaged and the grain silo destroyed, the country faced immediate shortages and the prospect of long-term supply chain disruption. The timing couldn't have been worse. The world was still grappling with COVID-19, global supply chains were strained, and Lebanon had few alternatives for importing the goods its population desperately needed. Local residents and volunteers began the long process of debris removal and rebuilding almost immediately. People swept broken glass, salvaged what they could from damaged homes and businesses, and began makeshift repairs to make buildings habitable again. Several hotels that hadn't been too severely damaged opened their doors to house displaced residents. International aid organizations set up temporary housing and provided essential supplies, but the scale of destruction meant that full recovery would take years if it ever fully occurred. The explosion raised immediate questions. How did 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate end up sitting in a warehouse in the middle of a major city for 6 years? Who knew about it? Why wasn't it removed? Who was responsible? The answers to these questions would prove far more complicated and frustrating than anyone anticipated. What should have been a straightforward investigation into obvious negligence would instead become mired in Lebanon's dysfunctional political system, revealing deep problems with accountability, governance, and the rule of law. On August 10, 2020, just 6 days after the explosion, Prime Minister Hassan Diab resigned. His resignation came amid growing public anger about the disaster and the government's failure to prevent it. Street protests erupted across Beirut and other Lebanese cities, with demonstrators demanding accountability and fundamental political reform. The protests were particularly intense because the explosion occurred against the backdrop of existing anger about Lebanon's economic crisis, political corruption, and government dysfunction. The explosion was seen not as an isolated incident, but as a symbol of everything wrong with Lebanon's political class. The day after the explosion, authorities moved quickly to detain people who might be responsible. 16 Beirut port officials who had overseen the storage and handling of the material since 2014 were placed under house arrest. The number of detained individuals would increase to 25 within the first few days as investigators cast a wider net. Interpol was asked to issue red notices for the arrest of Igor Gricheskin, the Russian businessman who had owned the MV Rosus, and Captain Boris Prokoshev. The theory was that the ship's owner and captain bore responsibility for bringing the dangerous cargo to Lebanon in the first place, even though they had abandoned it 6 years before the explosion. Judge Fadi Sawan was appointed to lead the investigation. He began summoning various government ministers, port officials, customs authorities, and security personnel to give testimony. He started building a case focused on criminal negligence, the failure of officials at multiple levels to address a known danger despite repeated warnings. It appeared the investigation might actually lead to accountability, but in February 2021, just 6 months into the investigation, Judge Sawan was removed from the case. He had made the mistake of attempting to charge senior government officials, including former prime ministers and ministers, with negligence. This crossed a line in Lebanon's political system, where powerful figures are typically shielded from prosecution. Judge Tariq Bitar was appointed to replace Sawan and continue the investigation. Bitar attempted to resume the work, but he immediately faced obstacles. The investigation quickly descended into a quagmire of political interference, legal obstructionism, and the kind of institutional dysfunction that had allowed 2,750 tons of explosives to sit in a warehouse for 6 years in the first place. Judge Tariq Bitar, the second judge appointed to lead the investigation after Judge Sawan's removal, found himself navigating a system seemingly designed to prevent accountability rather than ensure it. Bitar faced immediate and sustained resistance from powerful political figures. When he attempted to question or charge senior officials, he encountered legal challenges arguing he lacked jurisdiction or authority. Lebanese law provides significant immunity to high-ranking government officials, making it extremely difficult to investigate or prosecute them even for obvious negligence. Multiple former ministers and current politicians filed lawsuits to block Bitar's investigation, claiming he was biased or exceeding his legal authority. These legal challenges created a situation where the investigation would move forward briefly, then be suspended for months while courts ruled on procedural objections, then resume again only to face new challenges. The political infighting wasn't just about legal technicalities. Lebanon's political system is structured around sectarian power sharing, with government positions distributed among the country's various religious and ethnic communities: Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze and others. This system, designed to maintain balance and prevent any single group from dominating, also creates a situation where politicians protect members of their own sectarian community and political alliances take priority over accountability. When Judge Bitar attempted to charge officials from multiple sectarian groups, he faced opposition from all sides. No political faction wanted their own members held accountable, and they had the power to obstruct the investigation through legal challenges, political pressure, and control over government institutions. By early 2023, a remarkable and deeply troubling outcome had occurred. All suspects who had been arrested or detained in connection with the explosion had been released. Not one person remained in custody, not one conviction had been secured. 3 years after an explosion that killed 218 people and injured 7,000, caused $15 billion in damage, and displaced 300,000 residents, no one had been held criminally responsible. The investigation had effectively ground to a halt, deadlocked by political interference and legal obstruction. In March 2023, Judge Bitar made one more attempt to restart the investigation. He brought charges against Lebanon's most senior prosecutor, an unprecedented move that signaled his determination to push through the obstruction. But by mid-2023, when the script for this investigation was being written, nothing substantial had resulted from these charges. The investigation remained stalled, with no clear path forward, and no realistic prospect of anyone being held accountable for the disaster. The failure of the investigation created significant concerns in the international community. Foreign governments that had sent aid, human rights organizations, legal experts and international bodies all expressed alarm at what the Beirut investigation revealed about Lebanon's judiciary and political system. The case highlighted fundamental problems with rule of law, judicial independence, and governmental accountability in Lebanon. International observers noted that if such a massive disaster resulting from obvious documented negligence couldn't lead to any accountability, then Lebanon's legal and political systems were fundamentally broken. For the families of the 218 dead and the thousands injured, the lack of accountability was devastating. They had lost loved ones, homes, businesses, and their sense of safety due to failures that were documented in writing years before the explosion occurred. Lebanese customs officials had sent letters to judges requesting action. The Higher Defense Council had informed the president about the danger. Multiple people in positions of authority knew about the risk and failed to act. Yet none of these people would face criminal consequences. The message was clear: in Lebanon's political system, powerful people are above the law. The physical rebuilding of Beirut proceeded slowly and unevenly. Wealthier areas with better resources and international connections recovered more quickly. Poorer neighborhoods struggled. The destroyed grain silo, partially collapsed in the blast, became a symbol of the disaster and its aftermath. The damaged structure stood for nearly 2 years as a reminder of August 4, 2020. Then in July and August 2022, the weakened northern section of the silo finally gave way and collapsed completely. The collapse happened in stages over several weeks, sending up dust clouds that caused panic among Beirut residents who feared another explosion. The final collapse of the grain silo symbolically marked the end of one chapter of the disaster, though the consequences would last far longer. The destruction of Lebanon's primary grain storage and the port's reduced capacity had lasting effects on food security. Lebanon remained dependent on grain imports, but now lacked the infrastructure to store adequate reserves. This made the country even more vulnerable to global food price fluctuations and supply disruptions. When Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 disrupted global grain markets, Ukraine and Russia together account for a significant portion of global wheat exports. Lebanon was hit particularly hard, lacking the reserves that might have buffered against price spikes and shortages. The Beirut explosion joined a long and tragic list of disasters involving ammonium nitrate, demonstrating once again how deadly this common industrial chemical can be when improperly stored or handled. The 1947 Texas City disaster, which killed nearly 600 people, was caused by ammonium nitrate loaded on ships in a Texas port. The 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people, used a truck bomb made from ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. The 2013 West Fertilizer Company explosion in Texas, which killed 15 people, involved improperly stored ammonium nitrate. The 2015 Tianjin explosion in China, which killed 173 people, involved various chemicals including ammonium nitrate stored near populated areas. What all these disasters have in common is a disconnect between understanding the theoretical danger of ammonium nitrate and treating it with appropriate respect in practice. On paper, everyone knows ammonium nitrate can explode. Regulations exist in most countries requiring specific storage conditions, separation from combustibles, proper ventilation, limits on quantity stored in one location, distance from occupied buildings. But these regulations are frequently ignored or circumvented, especially when following them would be expensive or inconvenient. The material is so commonly used as fertilizer, farmers spread it on fields, garden centers sell it in bags that people become complacent about its explosive potential. The Beirut disaster was particularly egregious because the danger wasn't hidden or unknown. Lebanese officials knew they had 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in Hangar 12, they knew it was dangerous. They sent letters trying to resolve the situation, the president was informed and ordered action, but the bureaucratic and political system moved so slowly, and accountability was so diffuse, that nothing happened. The material sat for 6 years while everyone assumed someone else would deal with it. The welding work that triggered the fire was itself a failure of the most basic safety protocols. When performing hot work, welding, cutting, grinding, or any operation that produces sparks or open flames, near flammable or explosive materials, strict procedures are supposed to be followed. The area must be cleared of combustibles, fire watches must be posted, fire suppression equipment must be readily available, permits must be obtained, and the work must be supervised. These aren't obscure safety regulations, they're fundamental principles that every industrial facility should follow. But in Hangar 12, welders were working on door repairs in a warehouse that contained both fireworks and ammonium nitrate, two types of material that should never be anywhere near welding operations. Either the welders weren't informed about what was stored in the building, which would be a catastrophic failure of communication, or they were informed but the work proceeded anyway, which would be a catastrophic failure of judgment. Either way, the fact that welding was happening in those conditions demonstrates the breakdown of basic safety culture at the port. The firefighters who responded to the initial fire appear to have been equally uninformed about the danger they were walking into. Had they known that thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate were stored in the burning warehouse, they might have made different decisions. They might have established a much larger exclusion zone, they might have focused on evacuating nearby areas rather than fighting the fire directly. They might have survived. Instead, they apparently treated it as a routine fire response, moving close to the building to combat the flames, and they were killed when the main explosion occurred. This information failure, the fact that critical knowledge about the explosive material wasn't effectively communicated to the people whose decisions depended on that information, represents another systemic breakdown. Someone at the Port Authority knew what was in Hangar 12, someone in Customs knew, someone in the government knew. But that knowledge apparently didn't reach the contractors hired to do welding work or the fire department responding to the emergency. In a functioning safety system, information about major hazards would be widely shared, clearly marked and integrated into work planning and emergency response procedures. The international response in the immediate aftermath of the explosion demonstrated both the best of human solidarity and the limitations of external assistance when facing domestic political dysfunction. Countries around the world sent search and rescue teams, medical supplies, financial aid and reconstruction assistance. International organizations worked to coordinate relief efforts. The response was genuinely helpful and saved lives in the critical hours and days after the explosion, but no amount of international assistance could fix Lebanon's fundamental governance problems. Foreign aid could help rebuild damaged buildings and provide emergency supplies. Foreign experts could assist with investigating the technical causes of the explosion, but they couldn't force Lebanese politicians to hold each other accountable. They couldn't reform a political system built on sectarian power sharing and mutual protection of elites. They couldn't create rule of law or judicial independence where it didn't exist. The investigation's failure demonstrated that Lebanon's problems went far deeper than simply lacking resources or expertise. For ordinary Lebanese citizens, the explosion and the failed investigation that followed represented a crystallizing moment of disillusionment with their country's political class. Lebanon had already been experiencing mass protests in 2019 and early 2020 over economic mismanagement, corruption, and government dysfunction. The explosion and the failure to hold anyone accountable validated everything the protesters had been saying about the political system. It demonstrated in the most brutal and concrete way possible that Lebanon's leaders were either incompetent, corrupt, or both, and that ordinary citizens would pay the price for elite failures. The protests that erupted after the explosion were particularly intense precisely because they came after years of accumulated frustration. People weren't just angry about the explosion itself, they were angry about the economic crisis that had seen their savings become worthless due to currency collapse. They were angry about electricity blackouts, water shortages, garbage collection failures, and all the other ways that basic government services had broken down. They were angry about corruption, nepotism, and a political class that seemed to care only about maintaining power and enriching themselves while the country fell apart. The explosion was the final proof that the system was broken beyond repair. The resignation of Prime Minister Hassan Diab 6 days after the explosion was symbolically significant but ultimately meaningless. Diab was replaced by another prime minister, but the same political factions and power structures remained in place. The faces changed, but the system didn't. Lebanon continued to be governed by the same sectarian political parties, the same elite families, the same networks of patronage and corruption. The explosion didn't trigger fundamental political reform, because the people with the power to implement reform were the same people who benefited from the existing system and had no incentive to change it. By 2023, 3 years after the explosion, Beirut had partially recovered physically, but not politically or psychologically. Some buildings had been repaired, some displaced residents had returned home, economic activity had resumed, though the country remained mired in financial crisis. But the fundamental issues, the lack of accountability, the dysfunction of government institutions, the impunity of political elites, remained unresolved. The explosion had changed nothing about how Lebanon was governed. The MV Rosus, the ship that had brought the ammonium nitrate to Beirut in 2013, remained at the bottom of the harbor where she had sunk after being abandoned. Her journey from Japan to Georgia to Beirut, carrying a cargo that would kill 218 people 7 years after she arrived, represented the kind of mundane maritime commercial transaction that happens thousands of times daily around the world. A ship chartered to move cargo, experiencing financial difficulties, getting impounded in port, crew eventually leaving, cargo offloaded and forgotten about. Except in this case, the forgotten cargo was enough explosive material to devastate a city. Igor Grachushkin, the Russian businessman, who had owned the MV Rosus, lived in Cyprus, and had never been extradited to Lebanon despite the red notice issued by Interpol. His involvement in the disaster was primarily as the negligent owner of a poorly maintained ship who abandoned his property and cargo when it became financially inconvenient. While morally culpable for bringing the dangerous material to Lebanon and then walking away from it, he arguably bore less responsibility than the Lebanese officials who then allowed that material to sit improperly stored for 6 years, despite knowing the danger. Captain Boris Prokofiev, who had tried to refuse additional cargo because of the ship's compromised hatches, who had been trapped aboard for a year before finally escaping, was also named in arrest warrants, despite the fact that he had attempted to do the right thing and had been victimized by the shipowner's decisions. The fact that authorities sought to blame the ship's crew while allowing senior government officials to avoid accountability perfectly illustrated the dysfunction of the investigation. The cargo's original destination, Fábrica de Explosivos Mozambique in Matola, Mozambique, never received the ammonium nitrate they had purchased. One wonders how different history might have been if the MV Rosus had been seaworthy enough to complete her journey, or if Grachushkin had paid the Suez Canal fees, or if the additional cargo that would have generated that fee had been successfully loaded despite the damaged hatches. The explosion that devastated Beirut might have occurred somewhere else, or might not have occurred at all if the material had been properly used for its intended purpose as fertilizer. The lessons of Beirut are clear, but seem destined to be ignored, just as the lessons of Texas City, Tianjin, West, and countless other ammonium nitrate disasters have been repeatedly ignored. The material is dangerous and must be stored properly, separated from ignition sources, in facilities designed for explosive materials, away from populated areas. Hot work should never be conducted near explosive materials without rigorous safety procedures. Information about hazardous materials must be effectively communicated to everyone who needs to know. Government oversight and inspection of facilities storing dangerous materials must be consistent and effective. And critically, when problems are identified, when customs officials send letters warning about improperly stored explosives, when presidents order dangerous materials removed, the bureaucratic and political system must be capable of actually taking action before disaster strikes. But implementing these lessons requires functional governance, which is exactly what Lebanon lacked. The explosion occurred not because no one knew about the danger, but because the political and bureaucratic system was incapable of acting on that knowledge. And 3 years later, that same system proved incapable of holding anyone accountable for the disaster. The investigation's failure is almost as significant as the explosion itself, because it demonstrates that Lebanon's governance problems are so deep and so resistant to reform that even a catastrophe of this magnitude isn't enough to force change. For the 218 people who died on August 4, 2020, including the firefighters who responded to the initial fire, the port workers who were near Hangar 12, the residents of nearby buildings, the people who happened to be in the wrong place when a warehouse filled with 2,750 tons of explosives detonated, there will be no justice. For the 7,000 injured, many of whom suffered permanent disabilities and trauma, there will be no accountability. For the 300,000 displaced residents who lost homes and businesses, there will be no compensation adequate to their losses. The failure of the investigation means that one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, occurring in a major city captured on countless videos from multiple angles, with a clear chain of negligence documented in writing over 6 years, resulted in exactly 0 convictions. The Beirut port explosion stands as a monument to the consequences of governmental dysfunction, to what happens when bureaucratic inertia, political corruption, and lack of accountability allow obvious dangers to persist until disaster becomes inevitable. It demonstrates that modern disasters often aren't caused by lack of knowledge or technology, but by failures of will, organization, and leadership. Everyone involved, from the customs officials who wrote warning letters, to the judges who received those letters, to the port workers who saw the material sitting in Hangar 12 for years, to the president who ordered its removal just weeks before it exploded, knew the danger existed. They just couldn't make their institutions function well enough to address it before it was too late. And 3 years later, those same dysfunctional institutions couldn't even manage to hold anyone accountable for the foreseeable disaster that their failures had caused. The explosion killed 218 people and injured 7,000. The investigation killed the hope that Lebanon's political and legal system was capable of reform, accountability, or justice. In some ways, that second death may prove to be even more consequential for Lebanon's future than the explosion itself, because it demonstrated to Lebanese citizens that their government is fundamentally incapable of protecting them or delivering justice when its failures kill them. The orange-red mushroom cloud that rose over Beirut on August 4, 2020, visible for miles, captured on video from countless angles, shared millions of times across social media, has become one of the defining images of that year. It stands alongside images of the COVID-19 pandemic as a symbol of 2020's cascade of disasters. But unlike COVID-19, which was caused by a novel virus that no one initially understood how to prevent or control, the Beirut explosion was entirely preventable. The material was known to be dangerous. The danger was documented. Officials were warned. The president ordered action. And still, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate sat in a warehouse in the middle of a major city until welding sparks set off a chain of events that killed over 200 people in seconds. That's the true horror of Beirut. Not that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen despite everyone involved knowing it could happen, and then after it happened, that no one was held responsible. It's a disaster that reveals not the limits of human knowledge or technology, but the limits of human institutions and the failure of political systems to prioritize public safety over the convenience and power of elites. And in that sense, it's not just Lebanon's tragedy, it's a warning about what happens in any society where accountability fails, where warning signs are ignored, where short-term convenience and cost savings take priority over long-term safety, and where the people with power to prevent disasters are shielded from the consequences when their inaction or negligence causes catastrophe. The people of Beirut deserved better than a government that allowed 2,750 tons of explosives to sit in their port for 6 years. They deserved better than welding work being conducted in a warehouse full of fireworks and ammonium nitrate. They deserved better than firefighters being sent into danger without information about what they were facing. And they deserved better than an investigation that 3 years later had resulted in exactly 0 convictions, with all suspects released and political elites protected from accountability by the very system they controlled. Until those fundamental governance failures are addressed, and there's little sign they will be, Lebanon remains vulnerable to the next disaster, whatever form it might take, because the institutions that should prevent disasters and deliver accountability when prevention fails have proven themselves incapable of performing those basic functions of government.